Welcome back to another video in our series, The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Today's topic is the book of Jonah, and we are joined by Dr. Amy Erickson, who is professor of Hebrew Bible at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, and also an expert on Jonah, has written a bit on Jonah, a lot, considering how short Jonah is. You know a lot. And so we're just grateful to have you with us today, Amy. Thank you.
Well, it's so fun to be here with people who care about the book of Jonah.
We do, and the people watching this do, or they will, I'm sure. Maybe to take us in, can you tell us a bit about the history and origins and like genre of this book? Because and I know the short answer might be we don't entirely know, but to help us figure out, we've been talking about timelines and history, and
Yeah.
do we know where this book is set, but also when this book might have been written?
Yeah, well, a little bit. So I think the majority of biblical scholars would say that it was written in the post-exilic period, the Persian period. So you have enough of a timeline, this group, to know what I'm talking about when I say that?
We do.
Yeah, we've been walking them through a timeline each week in our Sunday morning classes. So if you say Persian period, people should be able to put that on a mental map somewhere.
Excellent. Good, good. Yeah. So, as you know, the book is really short. So it's hard to date it with a lot of certainty based on the language. But given the language we're working with and that we have at our disposal, we think it's post-exilic. It also has a lot of themes in common with other post-exilic books, things that it's wrestling around with and trying to sort out. And so the big one, for me anyway, is thinking about how Jonah seems to be responding to this question, like, what does it mean that the God of Israel is also the God of the whole world? How do we understand who we are as Israelites in that larger understanding of God's care for everyone? Um, and I think that, like, we all kind of get that about Jonah, but I think it's actually played out in a much more interesting and fun way than has been appreciated.
Well, that opens a door for the next
Yeah.
question.
I'm trying to stop and let you in before I just,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what is the typical view and how should we appreciate it? What's the more expansive view you have in mind?
Yeah, well, so I think that especially as Protestants, and let me say I'm speaking as an insider here. I am a good Protestant. I was raised in the UCC with a father who's a pastor, so I'm a PK. So things I say about Christian readings or Protestant readings, like they're coming from a place of knowing that really well and wrestling with that myself. So okay, let me back up a little bit. So when I started writing this commentary on the book of Jonah, I was tasked with understanding it in the context of the history of interpretation. So I'm thinking about how Jews read the book of Jonah over time, how Christians read the book of Jonah over time, how Muslims, a little overwhelming. But one of the big insights from that work is that Christians have tended to read Jonah in ways that are a little anti-Judaic, that are not terribly appreciative, or even anti-Semitic in the history of interpretation. And that tradition, that suspicion about what Jonah is about, as rooted in Protestant understandings of ourselves vis-a-vis Israel and the Old Testament, is really quite striking. So what we have tended to do as Christians is say, that Jonah, they're making fun of him in the book. And I think that's absolutely true. But what we kind of stop there and say the book is trying to teach Jonah and people like Jonah a lesson that God has mercy for everyone. God is compassionate to everyone, wants to embrace the Gentiles, bring the nations into, his loving arms, that whole thing. And Jonah's just this sort of jealous Jew over here who's resentful that God's love is more expansive. Yeah. And you can see how that might get sort of problematic in terms of understanding relations between Christians and Jews. And so when Jews read the Bible, it's very different because they are seeing themselves in Jonah And they're also seeing their own struggles sort of played out on the stage that is the book of Jonah. So they're much more likely in their interpretations to be wondering, like, hey, what's the deal with God? Like, why the hell is God saving Nineveh? Of all peoples, of all places, and really wrestling around with that question and doing it, I think, in a way that amplifies the tension between God and Jonah, and that is sort of self-reflective in a way, like, not just that's not the way we want to be. We don't want to be like Jonah, but hey, our prophetic traditions here are going to look different if we are imagining a God who is caring for people beyond Israel.
So can we take this point and actually kind of map it onto the structure of the book of Jonah itself? Because if you're watching this video before you've read the whole book of Jonah, which is what we are recommending that folks do, which is not a big lift, it's only 4 chapters long.
That's right. You can handle it.
Right. Yes. Yes. This is one we really recommend you read the whole thing. Not quite the shortest, but real close. So if what you're coming into the conversation with is a Sunday school familiarity with Jonah, what you have is him getting swallowed by a creature that is often considered to be a whale, right? And then vomited back out. And it's sort of Jonah doesn't listen to God and then listens to God. But then there's this whole second half. And so I'm wondering if you just tell us how the book is structured and how the two parts kind of map onto this dynamic that you're talking about of Christian versus Jewish readings, these questions of mercy and forgiveness. How do these questions connect to the story itself?
Okay, let's take it from the top then. Let's start with chapter 1 and Jonah's refusal to do God's bidding. And so if you're not familiar with prophetic literature, you might say, like, what's the deal with this prophet just defying God? Because, of course, God comes to Jonah and says, you're going to go to Nineveh and you're going to speak to these people. I think at this point he says, because their evil has come up before me, right? And Jonah just runs in the other direction. He takes off. And so I think people think, well, that's crazy, right? Like, who would do that? Who would just say, God, I'm not even going to engage you in conversation here, or say, no, I'm just going to run the other direction. But actually what we have is this engagement with prophetic call narratives. So if you're familiar, say, with the story of Moses, part of the deal is that when God tells you you're going to go and be a prophet, you're supposed to say, no, I can't do that. You have to resist in some way so that the reader knows you're a legitimate prophet, because this is about God calling you to do something that you don't want to do. So it gives you this sort of authority to do it. So it's a long tradition in the Israelite literature that one is supposed to resist. But I think what also comes up in texts like Jeremiah and even in Isaiah and in other prophetic texts, Moses, it's like, can the prophet say no? Can a human being, when called by God, say no? And so one of the things that happens, I think, if you're thinking about sort of Christian and Jewish interpretations, is that Christians have tended to say, of course you can't say no. You have to say yes. There's something wrong with Jonah. He's disobedient. Ha, ha, ha. Look at him. He's so funny that he doesn't listen to God. And not reflect on the ways in which we all want to say no when we feel like we're being called to do something difficult. And Jews are much more likely, over the history of interpretation, have been more likely to kind of get into that dynamic and say, well, why did Jonah say no? And imagine all of these backstories for him, these reasons why he refused. So they have elaborate stories about, well, he's had this long prophetic career. And one time he preached to Jerusalem and they ran him out of town as a false prophet. And they are grateful for the fact that he is actually saying back to God, I don't like this idea that you want to interact with Nineveh, who's, sort of the heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This isn't going to, how could this go well for us? So there's more of a sympathy for Jonah's position as opposed to an outright condemnation. Do you want, I know that's just like the first 3 verses. Do you want to?
Oh, that's great.
Can I break in really quick and say, is the imagination that this is then prior to the fall of the Northern Kingdom? Like this is Assyria at its worst in the memory of Israel. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because of course they're writing, probably if we're talking post-exilic period, they're writing hundreds of years later. In fact, after Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, has been completely wiped off the map. So Assyria is at its height, like 8th, 7th century, right? Or even a little bit earlier. And in 612, the Babylonians completely destroy the place. And so people who would have been writing Jonah know that, which is kind of a crazy thing to wrap your head around. So it's set in a time when obviously Nineveh is alive and well, but it doesn't look like Nineveh. So if we're imagining that the Assyrian Empire, I mean, these guys were, if you've seen the reliefs that they have in their palaces, these Assyrian emperors, they're very proud of the fact that they put people's heads on pikes when they come in to destroy them after they haven't paid tribute. They're very proud of their military prowess. It's kind of like Game of Thrones on these friezes. So the disconnect between the Nineveh that we have, say in chapter 3, and the Nineveh of historical memory is one of the things that I think alerts us to the fact that this is something other than a serious account.
Yeah. So,
Thanks for that. I'll let you go back to Margaret's question. Yeah, or whatever your next one is.
No, yeah, because I want to take us now to that chapter 3, chapter 4, right? And when we do get to the scene of Nineveh, of Jonah prophesying, Nineveh repenting, God forgiving, that just sort of happens one after another, and it's almost sort of cartoonish, or that's maybe importing the wrong category, but Jonah doesn't even make it halfway through the city before the word gets up to the king, and then he says, who knows, maybe God will change his mind, and then everybody repents. I love that the animals repent. I mean, what are we to make of this? It's so hard to sort of understand whether something is humor, sort of in this beyond looking back at cultural categories of a much earlier time. But how do we understand the way that the scripture portrays this repentance and forgiveness that happens here?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Well, I think it goes back to the question, what kind of humor do we think that we're talking about here? And there's a category, it sounds kind of weird and wonky, but called diaspora humor that I think is super useful in terms of thinking about Jonah, because one of its hallmarks is that you see the ruler of the world, who's kind of this stock character that we see in the King of Nineveh, that we see in King Ahasuerus, in Esther, who's acting like a little odd, right? Like kind of over the top, a little bit of a buffoon, very suggestible, very interested in his own reputation. Just as you say, a caricature of this fool leader. But you also have the ability in diaspora humor to self-reflect. So there is a way of saying, hang on, we'll get to that. Let me talk a little bit about chapter 3, right? So diaspora humor is self-reflective, and yet it is also poking fun at people who have more power, at the emperors and leaders who clearly have the Jews' lives in their hands. And it's willing to bring God into this whole crazy carnival ride. So in chapter 3, what I think you have is exactly the shape of a comedy. So we use this kind of language of a U shape with comedy, right? So you come in and you hit a kind of tension point, and then it comes out and everybody's happy, So it's very formulaic in this way. And what I think is crazy about Jonah is that in the first chapter, you have Jonah acting like a complete anti-prophet. He's doing everything the way he's not supposed to do it. And suddenly in chapter 3, he's a super prophet. And so he comes in announcing, in 40 days or in 3 days, depending on which text you're reading, Nineveh is going to be, and according to the Hebrew, either it'll be overturned or it will turn around. So there's this sort of crazy play here that Jonah is like, I'm going to hedge my bets here. And in case it in case they do repent,
Right.
I'll get off the hook in terms of being, a false prophet or whatever. And if they don't, I'm also set here. I've said nothing wrong. I've said nothing untrue.
That's amazing.
And then they're all, just turning around, including God. So the best part, I love it, is when the Ninevites or the king of Nineveh says, like, who knows? Maybe God will change his mind. And God is like, just hand me a drink, and like puts on some sort of crazy hat and is like, yeah, let's do this. I'm going to change my mind. It's like he gets into the swing of it and is like out there in the conga line or something playing in this game. So it's a way of sort of suspending the real, like, horrible situations in which people find themselves oppressed and suffering and vulnerable, and saying, well, today we're just going to have a party and make light of it all. And we're going to imagine that God is involved in all of this. And I think it's a way of sort of like creating space for people to pose these serious questions without being undone by them, So again, I've seen Purim and the way in which everything is about reversals and authority and sobriety going into sort of a slide so that the imagination can take hold, and that you can kind of like celebrate the horrors that you endure together. Yeah. So lead me out into something else, guys. What do you want to...
Well, go ahead, Margaret.
No, Matt, this is your show. Go ahead.
It's not my show.
It's not your show. No. This part out. Matt and I divide up. One of us is Bert and one of us is Ernie for all of these videos. And Bert asks the serious questions and keeps us on track. And Ernie pipes up with the bizarre random questions. And I'm Ernie this time. So
and we do switch those roles.
We switch them off. Between videos. Yeah. So
I need one of those.
Well, every good, buddy film, has got everybody, they've got their stereotypical roles that they have to stick to. So,
like God and Jonah. It's like, well,
there you go.
Yeah.
So I want to go to Jonah 4 then, which only makes sense because we just did Jonah 3, and to say, what kind of point does Jonah have? Because there's something about God's forgiveness that, of course, is deeply offensive to some people. And we see this in different ways, in the Gospels with the prodigal son, maybe, or the workers in the vineyard. God here is forgiving sins against people Jonah knows, right? I mean, if we want to talk, so is Jonah right to be upset? Not because God is willing to avoid destroying the Ninevites, but that God has basically kind of wiped the slate clean. Is this a parable? Is this a parable? Is this a story that makes us wonder if God is really committed to justice or not?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, so
does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And Jonah 4, it took me probably like 5 years to decide what I thought was going on in Jonah 4. I mean, this is a crazy chapter. So let me start there to tell you what I think is going on in this text. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Because I think that we do read it the way that you're talking about, Matt, but I'm not sure that the text is taking us there.
Says that. Okay.
Well, it might say that, but it might say the opposite. That's the great thing about Jonah. Well, it could mean this, but it could mean it's complete and total opposite. So I actually translate that last verse, which is, does somebody have it? Because I should have put a Bible here.
Verse 11.
I can never find it, so I pulled it up.
Because you flip right past it.
Yeah, that's right. It's buried in there among the minor prophets. Would you like the last verse in the NRSV?
Please, yeah, it's doing it.
Okay, this is Jonah 4:11. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals?
Thank you for emphasizing them. Like, what the hell? What does this mean?
Right.
This is completely crazy. Right. So, okay. So there is no reason that we need to translate that as a rhetorical question. So the rhetorical question has us thinking, of course, I'm going to be compassionate toward Nineveh, right? But if we read it as a simple declarative, then how does it read? I am not
Concerned.
compassionate. I am not concerned about Nineveh. And I don't care how many animals they might give me in tribute. I'm going to destroy it anyway. So there are two ways to read it, right? Either I'm completely compassionate, and of course I'm going to spare Nineveh, or I have no pity. That's the language of the Deuteronomist of the Hebrew Bible, right? You're supposed to execute justice without pity. Don't worry, I have no pity, Jonah. So Jonah comes in with his accusation, which is also bizarre, of God being too compassionate, right? So he starts off saying, damn it, I knew when I was in my own country that you were going to do this, that you were just going to default to compassion. And we're reading this like, wait, what's wrong with God being compassionate?
Right.
But of course, part of God's role is to execute justice, not to just let everything slide because he's in the mood to forgive. And so Jonah's calling him out and saying, because this is the job of a prophet also. I mean, I think that's the other thing we sort of forget is that prophets are not just mouthpieces for God. They're also supposed to talk back to God and be sort of who do they call this guy? The prosecuting attorney, where they are questioning God's role. It's not the prosecuting. Anyway, don't use that language, but I'm just sorry, I got hung up on that. What was that word? I'm getting old. But at any rate, there is supposed to be, God has created prophets in part to talk back to him. So you remember the story of Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah? And God's like, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's like, but what if there are some good people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Maybe you want to reconsider. And they kind of go back on this negotiation. Like, if there are 50 people, I'll spare it. And Abraham's like, really? Like 50 people? What if there are 30? You know, so the prophet is supposed to say, I think this maybe isn't a good idea. And in Jonah, it's all turned around because usually the prophet is trying to talk God off the ledge and say, don't destroy everything. And here Jonah is saying, wait, the balance is off. You need to execute justice in this situation. You're too merciful. And so if you read chapter 4 as God's attempt to respond to this accusation that he's too merciful, God may just come right back in and say, no, I'm not too merciful. I'm going to destroy Nineveh in my own time.
Right.
And I think that a little bit of theater in the middle of chapter 4 with the plant and the worm is, I don't know if we want to get into all of it, but I think that the plant in some ways stands for Nineveh in this weird Jonah kind of funhouse mirror to say the plant flourished for a time, the tree flourished for a time, and then I came and completely destroyed it. So, so hold tight, be patient. My judgment is coming, which is not maybe the message we want to hear, but yeah.
No, but it would make sense if this is being written at a time where everybody knows Nineveh has been leveled centuries before, at least a century before, right?
Yeah.
And
I
the plant,
go ahead. Yeah.
Just then the plant is not so much God just sort of personally messing with Jonah as a sort of sign act from God. I mean, this is helpful for me. I'm really confused by what God does at the end of Jonah. So
yes, well, I think actually both things are happening, right? So this is kind of why I think Jonah is hilarious, because on the one hand, God is trying to do a sign act, right? Like, okay, what's a good sign act that we can point to? There's an almond tree and this is what it means. Or, walk around the city naked for 3 years, Isaiah, because you're communicating X. So here's the sign act. And Jonah's like, why are you persecuting me? So Jonah doesn't even understand that it's a sign act. He doesn't get that this is a parable. It's played out on his body, and he can't understand why this is happening to him. So I think God is trying to communicate something, and Jonah isn't hearing it, and God isn't doing a very good job communicating because nobody else understands it either.
So he's like the opposite of Ezekiel, basically, who's just like, just heap it on me.
Exactly. Well, and actually, I think we're working with a different understanding of prophecy, whereby, again, what's being emphasized is not God as a mouthpiece, which is Ezekiel to a T. I'll eat the scroll and literally like regurgitate your words because I'm such a faithful prophet. I'll recede into the background in some ways, though in many ways not. And Jonah, who says, I don't want to speak your word and I have no investment in this. And what we end up with at the end is this dialogue, actually. So weird thing about Jonah 4 is that God and Jonah are allotted the exact same number of words, which is odd, unless you know about the Babylonian theodicy, which is this Mesopotamian text, which is a dialogue between two guys talking about suffering. It's like the first part of Job, where Job and his friends are going back and forth. And one is emphasizing experience, and the other one is emphasizing like larger theological principles about suffering. And the crazy thing is that God is Jonah's interlocutor, because the point of this dialogue is that where we find truth is by holding in tension these two completely opposing perspectives and truths. It is true that Jonah is miserable and feeling persecuted, and that what God is doing is not fair. It is also true that God has some sense of what God is doing in this case and has plans that Jonah can't understand. So I love the fact that that is encapsulated in the genre itself. Because of course, if you look at the book of Job and his friends are dialoguing back and forth, and then like, clear the way, here comes God in the whirlwind. And you get this like beautiful, lofty speech about the cosmos, for chapter upon chapter. And here God's like down in the muck with Jonah. And, having studied the God speeches, which are absolutely gorgeous in terms of their poetry and the richness of the mythopoetic imagery. And then God's like, 120,000 people who don't know their left hand from their right, and also a bunch of animals. How it's very much bringing God down to earth.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
We have time for one more quick question, if you want it, Margaret.
Okay. Oh gosh. Yeah, I love that final chapter, that final line about also many animals, also much cattle. The one thing we haven't talked about is actually Jonah chapter 2, this little prayer that gets sandwiched in the middle. Could you say briefly at the end here about what that's doing in the middle of this book?
I will try. I love Jonah 2, and I love that poem. So the reason the book of Jonah, I think, is so funny is because of the way it plays on extremes. And it's either making things really big or really small. So again, like if we're talking about the plant in Jonah as the huge cedar tree that represents empires, it's taken down to, the size of this weird little weed that just grows up overnight. And I think similarly with the fish that swallows Jonah, scholars have been fighting for a long time about whether there's an allusion to the Leviathan or to some sort of chaos monster here in the fish, or is it just a fish, So I think that what happens in this poem is that we get Jonah as a real Israelite. So the language of the Psalms that would root him in a temple liturgy, this is all on his lips, and the imagery of the Leviathan and being encapsulated by chaos and then being spit back out. I mean, it is a death and resurrection. And the early Christians were wild about Jonah. So I don't know if this is like a random little detail that, maybe everybody knows, or if this is just me because, Jonah girl. But the most popular images on the walls of the Roman catacombs are of Jonah.
Mhm.
So and by far. So, and I think they're onto something. So those of us who teach the Older Testament are always, kind of annoyed that the Jesus people come in and try to take over all our stuff, right? So I'll say things like, this is exegesis, not I see Jesus. So don't be looking for Jesus everywhere. But I think the early Christians had it going on because what they saw was this kind of imagery that Jonah is playing with, that it is a death and a resurrection and a transformation of sorts. But Jonah is still Jonah. So the process of transformation doesn't fix things, So even though Jonah has been, let's say, to use the metaphor of baptism, clothed in this new garb, it doesn't mean he doesn't still struggle with all the things that he was struggling with before. So that in chapter 4, we're right back to Jonah being grouchy as he was maybe in chapter 1, So, yeah, that's my quick version of
Well, lovely. Yeah, and very comprehensive to get the full scope of Jonah in 30 minutes. Your book is 450 pages plus of Jonah, so we could talk about this for a long time. It's a fascinating book, and you have been a wonderful conversation partner. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. A real gift to us.